One old photograph, one arrogant waiter, and a mysterious observer, the night dignity silenced a room full of privilege. LeBlanc shone like a jewel in the Chicago night, its French windows casting a golden glow that spilled onto the snow-covered sidewalk. Inside, crystal chandeliers chimed softly to the sound of ambient jazz, while waiters in impeccable tuxedos glided between tables occupied by corporate elites. The aroma of truffles and fine wine lingered in the air, mingling with the expensive perfume of socialites who laughed discreetly behind their champagne glasses. It was the kind of place where reservations were made months in advance, and where a single dinner could cost more than most people's monthly salary. When Harold Mitchell walked through the double doors of the restaurant, the contrast was immediate and palpable. His brown suit, though clean and neatly pressed, was a far cry from the Italian brands worn by the other guests. His shoes, polished with care that morning, told stories of many walks. Yet there was something about his posture that commanded attention, a natural dignity that radiated from every calculated movement, every firm step he took toward the reception desk. His eyes, behind simple framed glasses, carried a wisdom that only years could bestow. The hostess, a young blonde with a perfectly styled bun, looked up from her reservation list with an expression that wavered between surprise and barely concealed discomfort. Her gaze traveled up and down Harold, pausing momentarily on his hands that, despite their evident care, revealed years of hard work. She hesitated for a moment, checked her list again, as if searching for an excuse to deny him entry. But the name was there, impossible to ignore. Mitchell, table for one. Across the dining room, partially hidden behind an elaborate arrangement of white orchids, a man watched the scene with growing interest. His fingers tapped lightly on the screen of a high-end smartphone, his sharp eyes missing no detail of the interaction. There was something in his posture that suggested more than mere curiosity, perhaps a flicker of indignation, perhaps a hint of sadness. From time to time, he made discreet notes on his phone, as if documenting every moment of the evening. The hostess finally led Harold through the restaurant, passing by privileged tables where couples dressed in expensive jewelry and tailored suits enjoyed their elaborate meals. Each step took them further into the depths of the establishment until they reached a small table near the kitchen doors, where the clatter of dishes and the raised voices of cooks were clearly audible. Harold settled into his chair, with the same dignity he had displayed since his arrival, while the hostess placed a menu on the table with a quick, impersonal motion. But as Harold adjusted his napkin on his lap, with hands that seemed to hold the secrets of a lifetime, no one could have imagined that this simple table near the kitchen would be the stage for one of the most extraordinary nights in LeBlanc's history. Jake, the waiter assigned to Harold's section, approached the table with slow, deliberate steps, as if trying to postpone the moment as much as possible. His young, clean-shaven face bore an artificial smile that never reached his cold green eyes. As he moved, he stopped by other tables, exchanging warm smiles and enthusiastic greetings with customers wearing Rolex watches and gold cufflinks. The contrast in his demeanor was as stark as night and day. Harold, with calm and precise movements, reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a neatly folded white handkerchief. Though impeccably clean, the fabric showed signs of age along its slightly frayed edges. With methodical gestures, he began to clean his glasses, a ritual that seemed to transport him momentarily to another place, another time. For a brief instant, his hands paused in mid-air, his eyes focusing on something distant, as if reliving memories of an entire lifetime through those lenses. During this moment of reflection, Harold discreetly opened his worn leather wallet, and a small faded piece of paper slipped out, gliding silently to the floor. It was an old photograph, yellowed by time, its edges softened by constant handling. Before he could reach it, a young waitress passing by noticed and gently picked it up, handing it back with a genuine smile. For a fraction of a second she glimpsed the image, a young Harold, wearing a white apron, standing beside an industrial sink full of dishes. The moment was abruptly interrupted by Jake's arrival, who practically tossed the menu onto the table. "Good evening," he said, his voice laden with barely concealed disdain. "May I suggest some of our more affordable dishes?" His words hung in the air like a toxic cloud as his eyes scanned Harold's simple suit with an air of superiority. The silence that followed was filled only by the distant clinking of silverware and elegant conversations. Jake barely waited for a response before turning to serve a nearby table, where a couple had just opened a bottle of wine that cost more than a month's rent for an apartment in downtown Chicago. Harold remained motionless, his hands still holding the photograph, now carefully tucked back into his wallet. In the far end of the dining room, the mysterious observer made a few more notes on his phone, his face a mask of contained emotions. As the photograph returned to its resting place in the worn wallet, no one could have imagined that this simple black and white image held the key to a secret that was about to turn this restaurant upside down. A silver-haired woman at a nearby table watched the scene with growing discomfort. Her diamond-ringed fingers tapped nervously on the white linen tablecloth, while her eyes darted between Harold and Jake. Every so often, she leaned in to whisper something to her husband, who responded with discreet nods. The couple had witnessed every moment of the discriminatory treatment, and the tension on their faces was evident. Harold raised his hand politely, trying for the third time that evening to catch Jake's attention. All he wanted was a simple glass of water, a basic request that had gone unfulfilled for nearly 20 minutes. His hands, marked by decades of labor, trembled slightly as he held the menu. Not from nervousness, but from a thirst that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The noise from the kitchen behind him seemed to amplify each moment of waiting. From across the room, the unknown man remained still at his table, only his eyes moving to follow the scene. The wine glass before him sat untouched, forgotten amidst his absolute concentration. Occasionally, his jaw clenched, and his fingers gripped his phone tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. There was something in his gaze, not just anger or indignation, but a deeper, more personal emotion, as if each moment of that night touched an old wound that had never fully healed. The tremor in Harold's hands increased slightly as he finally caught Jake's eye. The waiter, who had just served champagne to a nearby table with elaborate flourishes and abundant smiles, turned to him with an expression of complete disinterest. It was as if Harold were invisible, an inconvenient ghost in the luxury of LeBlanc. The contrast between the treatment given to other customers and the one reserved for Harold became more glaring by the minute. The silver-haired woman at the adjacent table could take it no longer. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the thick carpet. Her husband tried to stop her with a cautioning look, but she had already made up her mind. Just as she was about to intervene, something made her pause. The mysterious man had made an almost imperceptible gesture, shaking his head slightly. There was something in his eyes, a silent certainty that this story needed to unfold naturally. The silence hanging over that small table near the kitchen was deafening, but what no one knew was that this same silence was about to turn into one of the most defining moments ever witnessed in that restaurant. Jake finally approached Harold's table, pulling out his notepad with a brusque, impatient motion. "May I suggest something more suitable for your budget?" he said, his eyes deliberately scanning Harold's simple suit. Without waiting for a response, he began listing the cheapest dishes on the menu, his voice dripping with thinly veiled disdain. Harold took advantage of a pause between the unwanted suggestions to politely request, "A glass of water, please." But Jake continued speaking as if he hadn't heard him. The waiter's words stirred memories in Harold, memories he preferred to keep buried. Every gesture of contempt echoed countless other moments in his life. Closed doors, dismissive glances, forced smiles. His hands resting on the menu had stories to tell. Calluses from endless dishwashing, burns from scalding water, scars from broken glass. Each mark was a silent testament to a life of work and perseverance. Maria, the young waitress serving nearby tables, watched the scene with growing unease. Her fingers gripped her tray nervously against her chest as she witnessed the discriminatory treatment. There was something about Harold's silent dignity that reminded her of her own grandfather, who had faced similar prejudices when he first arrived in the country. She moved anxiously between the tables, torn between the urge to intervene and the fear of losing her job. At the far end of the dining room, The mysterious observer gripped his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face, once a mask of composed detachment, now revealed signs of deep, restrained emotion. Each new note he typed seemed to take immense effort, as if every word carried a personal burden. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, and in his mind, a clear image appeared. Himself, years ago, running between 3 different restaurants, endlessly washing dishes at each one. The smell of industrial detergent still felt fresh in his memory, as did the sensation of his hands cracked from the hot water. But each washed dish meant a few more dollars toward his son's education. Each sleepless night was an investment in the future. When his eyes opened again, they met Jake's scornful gaze, who still awaited his order. Jake's words cut like knives, but they were not the first scars Harold carried. What no one suspected was that this night still held surprises that would make all those scars worthwhile. The tension in the restaurant grew like a silent wave. Other customers began to notice the way Harold was being treated. Some averted their eyes in embarrassment, while others watched with growing indignation. A woman in a red silk dress whispered something to her companion, clear disapproval in her voice. The murmur of conversations subtly decreased, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment in this uncomfortable scene. Harold maintained his composure with a dignity that seemed to be woven into his very being. His movements were measured and precise as he still waited for the glass of water he had requested minutes ago. An attentive observer might have noticed how his hands, though steady, occasionally clenched over the menu, not out of nervousness, but from the effort it took to maintain his patience. His eyes, behind simple glasses, carried the weight of 1,000 nights like this, 1,000 moments in which he had to prove his worth simply for existing. In his mind, images of the past danced like shadows. Young Harold, newly arrived in Chicago, knocking on door after door in search of work. The memory of a restaurant manager saying, "People like you start at the back door," still echoed in his ears. But he had accepted every challenge, every humiliation, turning them into stepping stones towards something greater. That same manager could never have imagined that the young man he relegated to the dishwashing station would one day build his own empire. Jake moved between the other tables with exaggerated confidence, as if he wanted to emphasize the contrast in his behavior. As he passed Harold's table, he deliberately turned his back, pretending not to see the still empty glass. His attitude had become a kind of performance for the other guests, a display of discrimination that he seemed proud to be executing. "More wine, sir." His sugary voice was artificial as he addressed an executive at the next table. The mysterious observer had abandoned any pretense of subtlety. His eyes now followed Jake's every move with an intensity that could burn. His posture had changed slightly, more upright, more present, like a predator ready to strike. His hands, previously occupied with his phone, now lay flat on the table, fingers drumming in a rhythm that suggested not patience, but a countdown. As the air in LeBlanc grew denser with unresolved tension, no one realized they were about to witness a moment that would transform this night of discrimination into a lesson no one present would ever forget. Jake finally returned to Harold's table, this time with no attempt at politeness. In his hands at last was the glass of water that had been requested so long ago, but his motion as he placed it on the table was deliberately careless, causing a few drops to splash onto the white tablecloth. The silence that followed was thick with expectation. Other diners had stopped their conversations, their silverware hovering in midair, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. Harold's dignity remained unshaken as he calmly dabbed at the spilled water with his napkin. This simple act, performed with such serenity, seemed to infuriate Jake even more, whose face now betrayed signs of barely contained anger. It was as if Harold's very calmness was a personal challenge, an affront to his self-proclaimed authority in this world of privilege. The waiter stood still beside the table, his shadow looming over the older man. LeBlanc, usually a symphony of elegant conversations and discreet laughter, had transformed into a silent theater. A single, dignified tear slipped down Harold's face, not from humiliation, but from a profound sadness at seeing that, even after so many decades, some aspects of society remained painfully unchanged. He wiped it away discreetly, his gesture carrying the weight of thousands of similar tears shed by others before him. At that moment, Jake, unable to endure Harold's silent dignity any longer, leaned over the table and said in a voice loud enough for neighboring tables to hear, "Some people really don't know their place." His words dropped into the room like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock throughout the space. Forks and knives clinked against plates in a sudden, stunned silence. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the air like thunder. The mysterious observer had risen, his face a mask of controlled determination. His steps were firm and deliberate as he crossed the dining room toward Harold's table. Each step echoed in the breathless silence of the restaurant, as if time itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. In the moment that man began his walk through LeBlanc's dining hall, no one could have imagined that they were about to witness not just a confrontation, but a revelation that would shake the very foundations of this temple of privilege. The man stopped beside Harold's table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the restaurant. The air seemed to have been sucked from the room as he finally spoke, his voice thick with restrained emotion. "Good evening, Dad." The two words fell like a bomb in the silence of LeBlanc. Jake, who was still standing nearby, took a stumbling step backward, the color draining from his face. The transformation in his expression was instant, from disdain to horrified comprehension. David Mitchell, CEO of one of the largest restaurant chains in the country and the owner of LeBlanc, placed a gentle hand on his father's shoulder. His voice, though controlled, trembled slightly with a mix of pride and indignation as he addressed the guests. "This man you see here started as a dishwasher 40 years ago." The silence was absolute, every word reverberating off the restaurant's walls as a testament to the truth being revealed. David's next words cut through the air like blades. "While others slept, my father washed dishes on 3 different shifts so I could study at the best schools. His hands, the same hands some here deemed unworthy of holding crystal glasses, built an empire now worth billions." Harold remained seated, his dignity now radiating like a beacon that illuminated the hypocrisy of the entire restaurant. Silent tears streamed down Maria's face, the young waitress, while the elderly woman at the nearby table covered her mouth in shock. Jake tried to stammer something resembling an apology, but David cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You're fired. Leave now." The words were spoken with a finality that left no room for argument. The waiter, now utterly humiliated, fumbled with trembling fingers to untie his apron, his former arrogance replaced with palpable shame. Other staff members watched in stunned silence as the reality of the moment sunk in. Harold finally stood up, his movement slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of decades of silent dignity. Father and son embraced in the middle of the dining room, a moment that perfectly captured the triumph of perseverance over prejudice. The entire restaurant, as if waking from a collective trance, erupted in spontaneous applause. It was an ovation that celebrated not only this moment of justice but acknowledged a greater truth about worth, dignity, and appearances. That night, LeBlanc witnessed more than just a revelation. It became a moment of transformation that would echo far beyond its elegant walls, reminding everyone that true greatness could never be measured by the price of a suit or the color of one's skin. By the next morning, the story of what had happened at LeBlanc was already circulating across social media at lightning speed. Videos secretly recorded by customers captured the exact moment of the revelation, and the image of the embrace between father and son became a powerful symbol in the fight against prejudice. Comments flooded in, sharing similar stories and praising the quiet dignity with which Harold had faced the situation. LeBlanc, once known only for its exclusivity, was now at the center of a national conversation about discrimination and privilege. David Mitchell used the incident as a catalyst for meaningful change across his entire restaurant chain. New training programs were implemented, focusing on awareness and inclusion. Hiring policies were reviewed, prioritizing diversity at all levels of the organization. Harold, with his lifetime of experience, became a central figure in these transformations, sharing his story in speeches for employees and managers. His quiet, yet powerful presence now carried a new kind of influence. The former dishwasher who had built an empire was now inspiring a new generation. Young entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds found courage in his story, daring to pursue their dreams despite the obstacles. Business schools began using the LeBlanc incident as a case study, not just about discrimination, but about resilience and leadership. Harold frequently received letters from people who identified with his journey, thanking him for maintaining his dignity on that fateful night. Maria, the young waitress who had witnessed it all, was promoted to training manager, responsible for implementing the new awareness programs. She often shared how that night had changed her perspective on the power of silent dignity. The elderly woman who had nearly intervened became a regular customer, always making sure to personally greet Harold whenever he visited the restaurant. Under new management, LeBlanc transformed into a true model of inclusivity. Years later, Harold still visited the restaurant regularly, always dressed in his simple yet impeccable suit. His presence served as a silent reminder that a person's true worth was not in their appearance or social status, but in their character and dignity. The small golden pin on his lapel, now recognized by all as a symbol of his extraordinary journey, gleamed under the lights of LeBlanc, not as a relic of the past, but as a beacon of hope for the future. And so, what began as a night of discrimination became a lasting legacy, proving that sometimes the greatest lessons in humanity come from the most difficult moments, and that true dignity has the power to transform not just a restaurant, but an entire society